What up, Wizards? It's Dev, SPMTG, we like it at Magic, and we have another big old video for you today in terms of Magic the Gathering news. Just a huge week for MTG, man. It turns out we had some Tarkir Dragonstorm previews, got some Final Fantasy previews. In the midst of all that, at MagicCon Chicago, it was Pro Tour Aetherdrift, the first big standard tournament in a while. And the first big standard tournament, obviously, since Aetherdrift came out. So, the last time we went to Chicago and did a big old Magic tournament, CFT Sock walked in there with a slow Gurk deck, the likes of which we'd never seen, and walked out the champion. Would the same thing happen today? Well, not to spoil it too much for you, but not necessarily. Although the deck that took home both the first place trophy and the second and third place slots, probably not the deck you expected. So let's see what happened when the smoke settled and the dust cleared. What were the best decks in Standard? Let's take a look at the Pro Tour Aetherdrift top 8.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Make sure you like the video. All you got to do is hit the button shaped like a thumb. Maybe subscribe to the channel if you're into it. We do a lot of Magic stuff. And if you really feel like you can check out the Patreon. I need money. Help the channel out, aka me. But apart from that, we got to go ahead and start looking at this because there's a lot of information to cover. And we'll start talking about the top 8 by looking at the top 9. I know that's weird, but one of the stories from this weekend was Esper Pixie. Now, this deck was the boogeyman going into this weekend, dude. Not only was this one of the most overrepresented deck types at the event, and everyone knew it was going to be, but everyone game planned for this. Just about every deck had a main deck and sideboard plan against this. And not only that, but based on what some of the pros said, it sure seemed like when they were in practice, they knocked out the most games against Pixie. So it ended up having a red glowing target on it, larger than a Zelda boss's weak spot going into the weekend, and it really showed, despite the really high number of players on the deck, the best it could muster was 9th place. So in some ways, we're not really answering the question, what's the best deck in Standard? We're answering the question, what crushes Esper Pixie the most? And we definitely got answers to that question. So let's look at the top 8. Now, 8th place was Ian Robb with Mono Red Aggro here, and it's a pretty traditional, very familiar looking Mono Red Aggro list, so I'm not going to spend too long looking at it, but I do want to look at it for a little bit because it's sometimes nice to refresh yourself in the old ways. All right, seems like a pretty good deck for a first time ever Pro Tour, right, Ian Robb? Good job. You want to make Mythic on Arena? You play Mono Red. You want to hit a Pro Tour top 8? You play Mono Red. Same basic idea, and again, this deck list has not changed much from what we've seen in the past. This has the Manifold Mouse, Heartfire Hero, Emberheart Challenger, basic Mice package, so you could call it Mono Red Mice if you wanted, but it's also got the Hired Claw in the 1-drop slot, Monastery Swifty in the 1-drop slot, and Screaming Nemesis as our only real, 3-drop threat. Monstrous Rage is the only pump spell that's ported over from some of these other Gruul decks that are more pump spell happy, and some of the older Mono Red decks from a few months ago that again would often resort to some really wacky pump spells in order to get this thing going. But it turns out Monstrous Rage is just mini cuts above every other pump spell in the entire format. Beyond that, there's 4 Burst Lightning to deal damage to the opponent's dome and 4 Lightning Strike to do the same with that funky Aetherdrift art. There's an Aetherdrift card in the Pro Tour right there, but Witchstalker's Frenzy is also in here in case you encounter a 5 toughness creature. It could be a Sheldred, it could be anything, it could even be a boat. And apart from that, I guess we can look at the sideboard. Can't we do that? You make your Soulstone Sanctuary a mouse, your Rockface Village helps your mice. There's not much to look at in the mana base, right? So as far as the sideboard, there's Lithomantic Barrage against any number of decks that play planes or islands, or both. There's a lot of decks like that right now, but Torch the Tower is also in here as a 3-up from we need even more small ball removal. Sunspine Lynx is our only 4-drop in the entire 75, and that's because it takes advantage of a lot of different decks playing tons of non-basics, so we can resolve this. It can Lava Axe the opponent and give us a 5-4. There's a full 4-up Witchstalker Frenzy when you count the full 75 cards here, and that makes sense in case, again, we run up against large creatures, and there were a ton of them at this tournament. Finally, Ghost Vacuum is in here to take out any, random reanimator strategies you might have to deal with, but we're not too worried about them for the most part. Again, there's nothing flashy about this build, but there doesn't need to be. A fantastic finish for a first-time Pro Tour competitor here who brought a tried-and-true deck that always gets results to some extent. But let's move on to 7th place, which is a new old deck, right? We've all seen variations of Blue-White Oculus. Ever since a Boron Oculus and Helping Hand were printed into the same format, they go together like coffee and an egg sandwich. I think it's really delicious, but we have added red to the deck. I wouldn't say we, a lot of players at this event added red to the deck for a couple of reasons, right? It turns out if you play blue, you have to play like Moment of Truth and cards that aren't usually very great, like Founding of the Third Path is sometimes in this deck. Let's kick the bad cards out, bring in good cards, and also get aggressive as a result. Kenta Harane bringing out the Jeskai Oculus, one of Japan's perennial pros, really cementing his name over there, and now he brings himself to a Pro Tour to get some more points and such. He just did really well at this event, obviously, by making the top 8, but how did he do it? Well, again, we've seen a Born Oculus index. We've obviously seen Helping Hand index, which is down here with the other 2 copies of Recommissions. So 6, reanimator effects that don't cost much mana and can get our Oculus back. But again, this deck, like I was saying, trades out, stuff like Moment of Truth and just like, again, to put it bluntly, bad cards. Cards that just don't have that much impact on a game of Magic. And it subs in stuff like Fear of Missing Out, which is pretty amazing. This allows us to pitch a card when it comes into play and get a card deeper into our deck. Those are both good things. Puts a body on the table against the aggro decks and also against slower decks that can attack. And later on in the game, it can give you, 2 attack steps with an Born Oculus, which is wild. It's so good, right? But Spyglass Siren is also in here as just, an early game creature that does an awful lot for the deck. Steam Core Scholar helps us pitch more cards into our graveyard for the Born Oculus. And Inti is a great way of attacking while pitching cards into our yard. So you see, it goes like I was saying, Fear of Missing Out, Inti. We're replacing some more kind of low impact blue cards in our deck with some higher impact red cards that allow us to get aggressive when we need to, grow our creatures when we need to, kind of pressure them with Spyglass Siren, Fear of Missing Out, Inti in the early game, these like decent early game creatures, right? But the deck also gets to slot in Torch the Tower, which is better than Elspeth's Smite for the most part and, accomplishes a lot of the same goals. There's an Into the Flood Maw in this deck for some extra tempo, along with a bounce off from Aetherdrift, just the strictly better Unsummon that you will play if you're going to play Unsummon anyway. And then 2 Spell Pierce, which is technically a new card from Aetherdrift, even though it's a reprint. We've had a million cards. It's just a million times. It's definitely worth having in the main deck, mostly to throw off opponents' removal or their big plans or their big turn on turn 3, 4, 5. They want to play a non-creature spell and do something cool. You're going to be like, no, I'm going to get Oculus instead of you doing that thing. So it's just really swingy play if you can take advantage of the tempo inherent in the card. Prophecydetic Memory is also here. That's kind of an interesting call. You are, drawing a fair number of cards in this deck through Steam Core Scholars and Fear of Missing Outs and whatnot. Bitter Reunion is also in here. This not only allows us to pitch cards, draw cards for Prophecydetic Memory and those effects and stuff like that, but also gives our Oculus potential haste, which is, again, just absolutely crazy to add to the deck. So there's a lot of red cards that wanted to be in this deck. I don't know why it was just Azorius for so long, because it's not like there's a bunch of new red cards or anything like that. It's just a lot of the same stuff we've already seen. As far as the sideboard goes, you've got your Ghost Vacuum, which you're going to be seeing in a lot of sideboards. To Pyroclasm, interesting call to shut down the smaller decks. Negate is... We're playing Islands. Destroy Evil is in the deck. This is a card that crept its way into main decks over the weekend. It turns out it's really good against the Zur decks, and Zur decks are important. Again, more on that later. Filigree Silex to take out small creatures and tokens and stuff like that, but there's a lot of one-drop creatures in the environment. Chandra Spark Hunter is in here. For some reason, this is the emblem. I don't know why it's programmed to be the emblem, but this is actually one of the first brand new cards from Aetherdrift that we're seeing in any 75 card list, and it's going to be one of the only for now, and more on that towards the end of the video and why I think that is. Chandra Spark Hunter is an interesting card to have in your board. There aren't really any vehicles that this can do anything with, but it can discard cards for you, which I guess is good for your Oculus helping hand plan. But I guess it's also just a thing that can generate a vehicle for you every turn. It can draw cards for you and stuff. So it makes sense to have, just a value planeswalker that this deck can especially appreciate. And then Brotherhood's End, along with the Pyroclasm, we've got a lot of sweepers because we can function that way if we need to. Yeah, that was Kenta's build over the weekend. And even though it wasn't the only Jeskai Oculus build, it was the one that did the best. Let's move on to 6th place here. Interesting because Lucas Ducal decided to bring an illegal deck to the event. Right? Or at least it's illegal in best of 1. You may not be able to play the red Leyline there, but in best of 3, it's still perfectly legal. So let's do that, and let's play a little green while we're at it. Now, Lucas, I should point out before we go into the deck, has been a really good player over this last year, cementing his spot. This dude has gotten really good results in like World Championship 30, I think a top 8 in Pro Tour Outlaws, if I'm not mistaken. So again, this dude's been playing the best Magic of his life over this last year, and he decided to bring Gruul Leyline. If it's so broken that it has to be banned in best of 1, how good is it in best of 3? Well, good enough for a top 8 berth in a Pro Tour event. That's pretty dang good. So what are we doing here? Well, again, this is a pretty familiar list. Heartfire Hero, Monastery Swiftspear, Emberheart Challenger, right? The sort of mice package. But in this case, you don't have the mouse that gives them double strike and trample and all that. We're not doing that. It's too slow for this build. So instead, we're playing Cacophony Scamp, Slickshot Show Off, and 2 Callous Sellsword. There is no way in the entire deck to cast, the Callous Sellsword part of it. You're just playing Burn Together here and trying to kill them with Heartfire Heroes, Cacophony Scamp, or even Slickshot Show Off if it gets large enough. So this deck is going to play more of those pump effects I was talking about earlier. We've got Monstrous Rage, the full 4 of, just the best pump spell in Standard, but also Turn Inside Out to make sure that we can keep our board presence even though we're sacking dudes. That can be really good. And it also gives us a huge power bonus if we are going to cast the Callous Sellsword Adventure. There's also Might of the Meek in here, which gets us deeper into our deck, gives creatures trample, which can be super important if they're getting large anyway. And just a little +1/+0 if we control a mouse, which we usually do. We've also got 4 copies of Leyline of Resonance, the namesake of the deck. If this isn't your opening hand, begin with it on the table. And when we cast a pump spell, basically, then we get to copy the pump spell. So this deck is not going to play like any removal whatsoever. We're just all in on our plan, our creatures, and we need to protect our creatures. So we're playing a Snakeskin Veil, which you may notice is the only green card in this Gruul deck, in the entire main deck at least. There's obviously Questing Druid in the sideboard as well. And by the way, Manifold Mouse is in the sideboard too, so it does end up in the 75. Right. Paw Patch Formation is a card that showed up in a couple of Gruul sideboards over the weekend. No different here. We get a couple of copies, but by and large, there aren't a whole lot of reasons for green mana beyond the Snakeskin Veil in the deck, but we really need to protect these dudes if we're going to rip off a huge turn with them and get in deep with the trample on Might of the Meek or sacrifice them to Callous Sellsword or whatever it is. There's really not a whole lot of new tricks in this deck, but, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sometimes you don't need to teach an old dog new tricks because the tricks are so good and impressive and amazing and game-winning to begin with, and I think this is one of those cases. But in 5th place, we get to look at maybe not just the most exciting deck in the top 8, but one of the most exciting decks from the event period. And this top 8 finish really does help solidify how good this deck can be. Now, it's not a brand new deck. We've seen iterations of it over the past year, and the most famous player on the deck was not the one to bring it to the top 8, but Zevin Faust did get a top 8 finish with his build of Golgari Graveyard. The belle of the ball today, Mr. Faust, they call him, his first Pro Tour appearance ever, and really came in with a statement playing a deck like this. I believe that the mono red player Ian Robb is his teammate, and that's one way to make a top 8 appearance. You play some mono red, tried and true, you do what you came to do, right? This guy over here though, this guy Zevin, whose name is very close to my name, but a much cooler letter in front of the other 4 letters. This guy was like, no, me, I'm playing Golgari Graveyard, baby. How do you do that exactly? Well, it all starts with 4 Up the Beanstalk, as so many decks in this format too. The best decks from this event are all more or less Beans decks at their heart, but this deck goes about it slightly differently. There's a lot of tricks to play like a 2-mana spell. Or a spell that costs you 2 mana, or a spell that costs you 3 mana, and draw a card off Up the Beanstalk. We know all the exploits. Use Overlords, use, all these white removal spells that usually cost 5 or 6 mana, but they cost less if they target an attacking creature. Those things. All draw you cards off Beans. But you know what else does? Do you know what else actually draws you cards off of Beans? Cards that are considered usually not great, like Huskburster Swarm over here. Huskburster is an 8 mana 6/6 Menace Death Touch, but it costs 1 less to cast for each creature in exile and in your graveyard. Right, so not only that, but Hollow Marauder is a very similar creature, gets, less expensive for each creature in your yard. And Chitin Gravestalker, a brand new card from Aetherdrift, a 5/4 that would normally cost 6 mana, but in this deck it almost always only costs 1 mana, and you can cycle it into your graveyard. Apart from that, there's Souls of the Lost in this deck, probably the best of the Lurgoyf effects in Standard, especially if you don't want to add like blue to your deck for Lurgoyf, for Cruel Somnophage's Kicker, and Adventure modes respectively. Overlord of the Bell Bailmerk, one of the better cards in this deck, so we're going to play 4. This puts a bunch of cards in our yard and becomes a huge dude later on in the game and fuels more graveyard shenanigans. Senate Scout, amazing 1-drop in the deck, but so is Gnawing Vermin. Really cool. A deck with Gnawing Vermin in the top 8 of a Pro Tour. Amazing, right? But the deck has one other good 1-drop and a total of 12 1-drops, by the way, which I think is noteworthy. But it also plays Molt Tender, probably the card from Aetherdrift that I feel like, how do I put this? It's not a reprint. It's not being played in some role player mode or anything like that. It's not just some removal spell that got added to a deck. This is actually a card that made this deck way better due to its form and function. And you just didn't get a lot of that in terms of what Aetherdrift cards showed up at this event. I think Molt Tender probably had more impact on its deck's playability than just about any card that saw play from Aetherdrift over the weekend. This can mill cards in our yard, and it can function as a Birds of Paradise, a Death Ride Shaman, which is crazy. That's just it's a really, really good card. We can ramp into Swarms and Hollow Marauders that cost us more than 1 and stuff like that. But we can also just get more in a turn. Like I said, we're playing 12 1-drops. So that's going to allow us to double and triple spell if we have some ramp a lot more often. That can be really, really important. We've got Overwhelming Remorse in this deck, though, as a just a removal piece that's ridiculous in a deck like this. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in our yard. We exile a creature or planeswalker. So this also draws a card off up the beanstalk. So between Overwhelming Remorse, Huskburster Swarm, Hollow Marauder, Chitin Gravestalker, Overlord of the Bailmerk, we have got, and Harvester of Misery too, we've got like more cards in our deck that trigger up the beanstalk and for less mana than any other deck in the format. But once you get into the sideboard, Terror Tide is a sweeper. We don't care about sweeping our creatures as much. We want dudes in our yard. Cut Down for, a concession to the aggro decks. Harvester of Misery, another removal spell for all intents and purposes. Scrap Shooter is a creature. That's also a removal spell. That's important in a deck like this. Starving Revenant is a card draw spell. It's also a creature. Haywire Might is a removal spell. It's also a creature. You see, it's very important in this deck, but they did make room for 1 Duress and 2 Obstinate Baloth, which is a creature, but it's also really, really good in the Pixie matchup when they play like Hopeless Nightmare. It's really exciting to see a kind of rogue deck that's been under the surface for the last year or so, almost. Really, rise up to the level of top 8 Pro Tour, finish. So good job, Mr. Faust. You did great with this one. Now in 4th place, we have another one of the bad guys of this event and the definite bad guy of best of 1 ranked standard on Arena. It was Gruul Mice, in this case, piloted by Yu Chin Liu. And there's an interesting stat line here. On the weekend, in terms of overall game records, wins and losses, Yu Chin went 32 and 22, which is definitely a winning record, but that is far more game losses than all of his other competitors in the top 8 with him. So I imagine the sideboard must be really good here, or Yu Chin just plays really, really well in games 2 and 3, because often aggro decks, dedicated aggro decks like Gruul Mice want to win game 1 and finish off the match as quickly as possible. But with this many losses, it's pretty obvious that he had to dip into the sideboard and get to game 3 a lot more than aggro decks typically do. Now, one thing you may notice quickly is that this deck is not that much different from the mono red and other aggro decks we've already looked at. They tend to play a pretty predictable shell of cards. You see the 4 Monstrous Rage in here. There's a Burst Lightning. There's 4 Torch the Tower. Torch the Tower. There's a Witchstalker Frenzy. There's an Obliterating Bolt in this deck, which is a rarity in this top 8 in terms of aggro decks. But once you get to the creatures, again, pretty familiar cast. You've got Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero, Hired Claw is a good 1-drop, Manifold Mouse, so the mice are all here, Paw Patch Recruit, so you got another strong 1-drop in your Gruul deck. The big difference here, I think, is Innkeeper's Talent. All right, this makes our creatures larger every turn and triggers their Valiant effects, like on all of our mice and stuff like that. Obviously, makes, for a little bit more inevitability with things like Manifold Mouse, because that can give creatures double strike and or trample. And if you're making them larger every turn and giving them ward and making them double large whenever they get counters, and obviously this can become like pretty crazy pretty fast. If you're just putting a counter on like Heartfire Hero every turn with Innkeeper's Talent, that can end up being a buttload of counters once this is fully, leveled up. And again, along with the Manifold Mouse on the table, you're trampling over for 1,000,000 damage like fairly reliably, and it only takes like 1 creature on the board once a sweeper hits to like get back going. So Innkeeper's Talent gives the deck, for lack of a better term, some grindy value that also just affects the board the moment it hits the table, which a deck like this is looking for. As far as the sideboard goes, I want to say this is a special sideboard because of all the game losses over the weekend, and boy, he had to go deep in his sideboard a bunch of times, so maybe it's a special sideboard, but no, I just think Yu Chen Liu is a special player. The only real difference here is Sentinel of the Nameless City, which is another thing that can create map tokens that make our creatures larger over turns. If we get +1/+1 counters from the map tokens and we have a fully leveled up Innkeeper's Talent, we actually get 2 +1/+1 counters. The use of map tokens also counts as targeting a Valiant guy, so they get extra counters even if all you draw is a land. Sentinel's kind of an interesting, like, grindy inclusion against some decks, and note that against Pixie, it doesn't die to cut down, it doesn't die to nowhere to run. Those are important lines. It won't die against bolt effects like Torch the Tower against other mono red or red centric decks. So I kind of like the toughness here, and I think it's mostly to respect Torch the Tower and Nowhere to Run, but it's important to respect those cards right now, and I think that Sentinel does it in a pretty interesting way while benefiting the rest of the cards in the deck too. So it might be that Sentinel was the secret sauce, but I really think good play was the secret sauce for Liu over the weekend. He's just been consistent. Now, you'd think that I would be going to third place here, but I don't necessarily have to. I can skip all the way to first place because the third, second, and first place decks at this event were all different versions, yes, but all of the same deck, and that was Zur Overlords, sometimes called Domain Overlords. Now, people expected this deck to do well over the weekend, mostly because it has a decent matchup against Esper Pixie already, but I don't think anybody expected it to be quite as dominant against the rest of the field as it was. Not only are, bronze, silver, and gold, the entire podium, all occupied by this deck, and different versions of it, sure, but Matthew Nass really showed off how good this deck can be, either through his build or through his personal skill level as a player, because his win-loss record ended up being insane. He went a full 17-1 in match records over the weekend, with in games only 9 total losses, which is absolutely unbelievable. Now let's take a look at the best deck in the world. We're going to play 2 copies of Get Lost in here, just 2 copies. It's because we got to make room for stuff like Rides In. I was just mentioning white spells that cost less if they target an attacking creature, or in this case, a tapped permanent. This is just the best of these effects in Standard. Pretty easily. It only costs 2 mana when it's fully powered. It allows you to exile 2 different permanent types, and usually these cards don't let you do that. So if you're going to play one of these, this is the best one to play, and it procs you up the Beanstalk. That's right, this is actually secretly a Beanstalk deck. I alluded to that earlier, that we'd see more Beans decks, and this is really cementing itself as maybe the best card draw piece in Standard. There's also Overlord of the Mistmoors in this deck. This is the one that gives you the 2/1 flyers when it ETBs. This also draws cards off of Beanstalk, and is also just a lot of value on one card. It's good to see a value mid-range deck actually doing something in Standard. Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a lot of value on a card. Overlord of the Mistmoors is a lot of value on a card. Biza the Bounding Spring is a lot of value on a card. And Up the Beanstalk is a card that rewards you for playing 2 out of 3 of those cards. A main deck 3 of Temporary Lockdown. But I should point out that Matt's deck of, the 3 Overlord decks in the top 3 is the one that I believe plays the fewest sweepers, right? And the other decks, I believe, they added Split Up in at least one of them. Those decks will play like Day of Judgment. This deck is playing 2 Day of Judgment, I believe. Yeah, 2 Day of Judgment and 1 Sunfall, where the other decks are on 2 Sunfall. So again, these other decks added a Sunfall and added a Split Up over these numbers. It's also Leyline Binding, as you might expect. This procs Beanstalk, and when it's fully charged up through like Overlord of the Hauntwoods, getting everywhere, the land down on the table, then it's just maybe the best removal spell in Standard. Analyze the Pollen is in here. It can go get like Overlords or a Zur when we need it to in the late game, or it can just, get us lands, which can be really good. Haven't talked about Zur yet, who the deck is usually named after, but in this case it was ended up being called Domain Overlords. But Zur can turn our enchantments into Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproofers with, PT equal to their power, their casting cost. So, it makes a Leyline Binding a 6/6. Another reason Leyline Binding's good in this deck. But it's also just going to make Mistmoors, a 7/7, and Overlord of the Hauntwoods a 5/5. A lot this deck does, and I think it does it all very efficiently, despite the fact that it is a mid-range deck that plays a lot of expensive cards and stuff. It can still easily double spell on turns. It's got the ramp to do that. It's got card draw engines, and it's got reliable removal. So everything you want to see out of a mid-range deck, that core triangle of, decent threats, good card draw, good removal. And in this case, the land base is really good too. So easy to see why it's one of the better decks in Standard. Do I think it's the best deck in Standard? I didn't going into the weekend, but, you only have 3 spots on the podium, bud, and putting one deck in all 3 of those slots is pretty convincing. That's it for today. How do you feel about this, man? Is this a good standard tier list? Are these the best decks in standard? Is Esper Pixie still in that mix? And are there a bunch of other decks that might be in that mix, like Omniscience Combo or Collector's Cage or whatever? There's a lot to talk about when it comes to these results. But there are plenty of other stories from this weekend. The rise of Jeskai Oculus, the relative ineffectiveness of not only Esper Pixie, but Gruul Mice, another deck that a lot of people game planned for. So, again, we had a lot of sort of metagame shifts and developments over the course of just this one weekend that I think will have some pretty good ripple effects moving forward throughout Aetherdrift Standard. So again, there's a lot to talk about from this event. But that's all I'm going to run my mouth about for now. Just remember to do all the YouTube stuff on your way out. Hit the button shaped like a thumb, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon, link in the description, just $1 a month to vote on what content we do around here. There's all kinds of ways you can help the channel out, but you've already helped me out a good bit just by still being here watching this part of the video. Appreciate you for that, but now it's time for your go. Let me know down there in the comments how you felt about the stuff, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.